Good day, everyone, most especially to you, sir. I am Kimberly Panugan, and I'm with Christine K. Carillo, and we're going to discuss the Chapter 10, entitled Bureaucracy and Public Management and Democracy Development and Governance in the Philippines. So, the learning objective first is to identify the key concept and theoretical perspective for the study of Philippine bureaucracy and the system of public management. Second, to describe the transformations of Philippine bureaucracy, the influences upon its structure, functions, and processes, and its relationship with the executive and other political stakeholders. Third is to analyze the role of Philippine bureaucracy in facilitating or hindering democracy development and governance given the historical context of Philippine politics and government. And lastly, to explain the issues and challenges confronting Philippine bureaucracy and its system of public management, considering current trends and globalization, sustainable development, democracy, devolution, and governance. Bureaucracy and administrations are necessary elements in the Philippines government performance of its function as the operational apparatus or machinery of the state. With democracy as state ideology, the Philippines articulates its aspiration for participation, accountability, equality, rights and liberties, constitutionalism, welfare and development, among others. So over the years, the different Philippines constitutions, legislation, and executive policies have shaped and transformed the bureaucracy in each of the branches of government. So the executive, legislative, and judicial. But the principal reference point is the bureaucracy under the executive branch of government and its administrations or management of the public sector, its interface with the private sector, and recently since 1986 with civil society organization, the bureaucracy of the executive branch of the government essentially delivers the goods and services of the state, engages in policy implementation, and in recent years has rendered technical and professional assistance in policy formulation. So by understanding Philippine bureaucracy and how it's functioned by a system of public administrations or public management must take into account not only the state ideology and constitutions, but the society's culture, economy, political dynamics, as well as international factors. So at the threshold of the 21st century, the Philippines accommodated the pressure for change in the organization, structured and functions of bureaucracy, as well as the shift to new paradigms of public management and governance. So, this chapter describes the changing character of bureaucracy and public management in the Philippines in the context of changing constitutions, the structures of government, and dynamic policies, dynamic of politics. So essentially, it examines the rules of government, bureaucracy, and the process of democracy development. So the governance in the Philippines, it takes into account the paradigm shift that influence the practice and study of political science and public administrations contribute to the understanding of such phenomena. Overview of Western influences on bureaucracy and public management in the Philippines. So the study of Philippine bureaucracy and the public management inevitably involves the use of concepts, theories, perspective, or approaches that have been developed in the disciplines of the social science, political science, public administrations, management science, and policy science. The nomenclature, terms, and concepts used in both process and theories of bureaucracy and public management are vital to understanding Philippine bureaucratic structures, functions, and processes. In recent years, there has been a shift of the usage of the term management instead of administration. And for that matter, public management for public administration, even an interchange of terms. but it should be noted that there are distinctive nonsense and competing paradigms. So, an overview of the main concepts and perspectives that underlie Philippine bureaucracy and public management can help set the stage for understanding its setup and practices, as well as the change over time. Theory to practice and vice versa do not necessarily follow a neat linear nor cyclical pattern, as in the Philippine case where certain theories may have influence the institutional framework and operations of the bureaucracy, just as certain practices have evolved, which can serve the purpose of theorizing. So the history and dynamic Philippines politics sets the context for both the applications and derivations of theories, models, and approaches pertinent to the bureaucracy in public management. So, by American colonizations and tutelage of the Philippines on democracy, the application of Western theories and practices on bureaucracy and management, such that the structure was dubbed as a Western setup in Asian setting. So the Filipino character of the bureaucracy has been shaped by the infusion of the people's culture and political behavior. So including the legacy of Philippine pre-colonial society and culture, as well as experience with the Spanish colonial bureaucracy. So, the concept of bureaucracy in the framework of traditional public administrations, or the TPA, provided the foundation in the early years of the Philippine Republic under the 1935 Constitution. So, the influence of new public administrations, or the NPA, was felt in the 1970s, even as the U.S. was embarking on his as a challenge to TPA. But the Philippines, as a developing country in league with other so-called third world and developing countries, utilize the frameworks of development administrations, or DA. So in the decade of the 70s, throughout the period of the Marcos regime, attempts to shift to the innovative new public management, or the NPM, and governance had become evident after the 1986 People Power Revolution and 1987 Philippine Constitutions and the 1991 Local Government Code. Changing perspective. So while to some extent, Weber's model continues to hold influence, recent innovation and theory and practices have redefined the presuppositions and limits of government bureaucracy and its structure, function, norms, and the system of public management. So the attention on private sector organization model and norms had come in the wake of the constraints encountered with the bureaucratic structure and management processes, and in light of new challenges in both the global and home fronts of the state. So the era of change had been stimulated by the perceived inadequacy of traditional bureaucracy in public administration to cope with contemporary scenarios and the emergence of competing paradigms. So since the 70s, the pressure intensely felt in the Philippines had came from domestic, social and economic forces such as population increase, urbanization, and development, as well as political pressures and decentralizations and democratization. So by the 1980s, societies groups that played a vital role in the downfall of President Marcos in 1986. Subsequently, the Philippines faced the demand for redemocratizations and governance, and for responses to emerging trends of globalization and technological change. So, new public administration. The paradigm of new public administrations, or the NPA, emerged in the 1970s to address the gaps and problems generated by the traditional administration model. So it was also a response to the changing times with its emphasis on the new norms of equity, access, responsiveness, and participations compared and in addition to efficiency, economy, and effectiveness of the traditional bureaucracy. So the possibility of sentences and reconciliation of these norms had been considered. So changes in practices and theories in the West also triggered changes in the Philippine bureaucracy and public management, while rule, maintenance, efficiency, economy, and effectiveness were continued. The trend is to make the programs responsive, accessible, and affordable to the client or beneficiaries. So one of the Marcos regime's strategies was decentralization by decentralization by deconcentration. So, or the establishment of field offices in the regions to bring the services closer, accessible, and more responsive to the people. Okay, development administration. So, development administrations, but as the Philippines was considered a developing state, among others classified as a third world, there was a search for an applicable development model. So states in transition to self-rule after colonization aspired to become a democratic polity with a capitalist economy. So the Philippines included theories and models were formulated to explain the condition, development, and underdevelopment. Development administration was catchword to refer to the different theories and approaches for and public administration to achieve development in its political and social dimension. So in 1972, President Marcos declared martial law and worked out a new constitution in the attempt to legitimize the regime and pursue its brand development administration. So the state pursued various socio-economic programs to achieve national development under the authoritarian regime in which democratic institutions such as election had been set aside. This was a crucial period for Philippine bureaucracy, having been politicized and used for the political purposes of the Marcos regime on the pretext of bureaucracy of development until the 1986 EDSA People Power Revolution ousted Marcos and ended authoritarian rule. Okay, let's move forward. So, governance, democracy, and decentralization. So, in post-EDSA 1, the new 1987 constitutions paved the way for the democratizations of the Philippines. So the Philippines accepted the governance paradigm as evidenced by the provisions of the 1987 constitution. The political and constitutional mandates enabled by the new President Corazon C. Aquino to initiate changes in the bureaucracy intended to veer it into the re-democratization process and governance framework. So by this time, civil society groups or non-government organizations or NGOs and people's organizations or POs that struggled against Marcos had moved into the democratic space provided by the new constitutions and the Aquino leadership. So the 1987 constitutions legitimized the presence of civil society, society's leadership. So the 1987 Constitution legitimized the presence of the civil society, the NGOs and community-based or POs, and their participations in democracy and governance. So for this part, civil society groups channeled their tracks, record, and development work and advocacy during Marcos regime into the mainstream of Aquino government services. So delivery in public and public administrative system. So consequently, the bureaucracy faced the challenge of working with civil society and the new stakeholder. So furthermore, the Philippines government and its bureaucracy were influenced to consider other paradigms for the public sector, such as the shift in thinking from public administrations to public management, and from government government to governance. So the discourses of new public management pertain to both government and bureaucracy with such concept as public-private interface, reengineering, and reinventing government and entrepreneurial government. So governance had been considered as related to democracy since it enables various actors and society, namely government, civil society, and private business, to participate in decision making. So, new public management. So by the 1980s, the possibilities opened for government to assume new organizational and management models. So the work of Gabler and Osborne, 1992, made a headway in the discourses that explored the concept of public sector reform, entrepreneurial government, reengineering government, reinventing government, and new public management. So, in their work as reinventing government, Gabler and Osborne called for bureaucracy and transformation to become entrepreneurial, to adopt feature of the private businesses, organization, and to link with the private sector and other section in society. So they called for the shift to non-bureaucratic structures, processes, and norms. The contemporary and so-called expanded view of public administration recognizes that there is a bureaucracy respectively in the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government, and that these interact in the processes of public policy making. So, in another view, public management is the use of managerial, political, and legal theories, approaches, and processes to carry out the legislative, executive, and judicial mandates to accomplish the functions of the government and the state. So, the Philippines has been challenged by new public management as it grappled with re-democratization in its participation in the globalization processes. In post-EDSA 1, the government embarked on reorganization processes in the executive branch bureaucracy. So re-engineering, reinvention, deregulation, and privatization were affected to some extent. So privatizations has reduced, and the number of government agencies of the Philippines, the quality improvement, productivity measures, and other reforms entered the bureaucracy processes. Philippine bureaucracy and political and historical context. So, in the Philippine setup, the hierarchy of departments, bureaus, and offices subordinated to the executive branch of government is usually referred to as the bureaucracy. Although, it should be acknowledged that there is a bureaucracy in the legislature and in the judiciary, respectively, under the President of the Philippines. So, the executive bureaucracy is the locus of the civil service, referring to the professional career-level officials and personnel selected by merit system in given tenure of office that man the hierarchy of offices and departments. So given the dominant traditional public administrative model of more than 5 decades, the Philippines executive bureaucracy has traditionally been engaged in the implementations of laws and policies in the delivery of services. But in the post-EDSA 1, 1986, new paradigms have affected the bureaucracy. The terms public administrations and public management refer to the structures, functions, and processes for the bureaucracy to accomplish its role and the state and the political system. On the other hand, such field of practice should be distinguished from the academic discipline of public administration. So in the operations of bureaucracy, changes over time in its organization and system were related to the changes in the Philippines constitutions and to the directives contained in executive policies, legislation, and judicial decisions. So, political leadership styles have created the nonsense and dynamics of bureaucratic administrative or management behaviors. Influences have also came from elected officials, political parties, interest groups, civil society groups, and from public opinion. Politics in Philippines is a complex phenomenon given the country's colonial experience, the transitions from the democratic phase of self-rule to an authoritarian phase, and then to redemocratization. So, the use of so-called diachronic analysis is applicable in the case of the Philippine bureaucracy because it highlights the historical stages or phases of time within which changes in institution had taken place. So, this can be complemented by the synchronic analysis that examines the themes, patterns of change, and even comparisons in institutional development. So, the institutionalized analysis focuses on the essential organizational analytic variables, namely bureaucratic structures, functions, operations, and processes, and the stakeholders. So the behavioral approach can bring out the dynamics in the power relations. So, as essential focus of analysis is the Philippines bureaucracy, performance and democratizations and development in the country. So the historical and political context generally use the examined Philippine institutions applicable even for analyzing the bureaucracy span the following periods. So pre-colonial Philippines, Spanish colonial rule, and the brief period of the First Philippine Republic. So noong 1899. So American colonization in the 1990s, including the period of the Philippine Commonwealth and the brief Japanese occupations noong 1941 to 1944. The turning point as the Republican state with democratic structures and processes 1946 to 1972, and the period of authoritarianism noong 1972 to 1986, and the transition and the redemocratization stage since 1986 noong EDSA 1 and 2001 EDSA 2 People Power events.
So, let's proceed to pre-colonial Philippines and Spanish colonization. So, first is the pre-colonial. So, historical accounts describe the Philippines before and at the point of Spanish colonization in 1521 as composed of settlements called barangays, each of which was composed of extended kinship. So, the Philippines before and at the point of Spanish colonization in 1521 was primarily composed of settlements known as barangays. So these barangays were the basic political and social units and play a crucial role in the pre-colonial Philippine society. So these communities were led by a local chieftain known as a dato or raja. So the word dato served as the center of leadership for activities of the community and the focus of loyalty. The datos became the cabezas de barangay. So within each barangay, there was a strong sense of kinship and extended family ties. Family was a fundamental unit of social organization, and individual rules and responsibilities were often determined by their place within the kinship structure. So loyalty to one family and barangay was highly valued. So religion in pre-colonial Philippines was predominantly animistic and polytheistic. So people worship a variety of goddess and spirits, and religious rituals were an integral part of everyday life. The unity of church and state meant the presence and powers of the Spanish friars of the Catholic Church in the affairs of the Spanish colonial government in the Philippines. So these beliefs and practices persisted even after the arrival of Spanish colonizers, although they were often syncretized with Christianity. So next is the Spanish colonization. So the Spanish colonial rule established a centralized system of government, a system of public revenues and public expenditures managed by a special and privileged class of bureaucrats, mostly Spanish. So, the Spanish colonization of the Philippines began with Ferdinand Magellan's arrival in 1521, so marking the start of a significant transformation of Philippine society. The Spanish introduced Christianity, imposed a new system of governance, and significantly impacted the culture of way of life of the Filipino people. So the Spanish established a centralized government in Manila, which served as the capital of the Philippines. From Manila, Spanish officials governed the entire archipelago, so Spanish bureaucracy, the Spanish crown appointed colonial officials to oversee the administration of the Philippines. So these officials included the Governor General, who was the highest ranking authority in the colony. So and other bureaucrats who held various positions within the colonial government. So public offices were granted as a favor from the king to those who participated in the conquest and pacification of the colonies, up to descendants, but could be dismissed at the pleasure of the king. So the indigenous Filipinos faced social, economic, and political oppression under Spanish rule, and the legacy of colonialism continues to influence the Philippines to this day. So in the years of self-rule, the bureaucracy and political leadership would be confronted with the issues of lack access, marginalization of the poor, social unrest of the peasants, and land tenure problems that were traced to the systems during the Spanish colonization. So next is the Marcos authoritarian regime, politicization, and sublation of the bureaucracy. So Philippine bureaucracy and the system of public administration were reorganized as Marcos Declaration of Martial Law on September 21, 1972, as heard in his authoritarian regime. So bureaucracy was brought into the ambit of Marcos' political power and control and used for the purposes of the regime. This situation is referred to as the politicization of the bureaucracy, subservience of the bureaucracy, co-optation of the bureaucracy, and in Carreño's term, the sublation of the bureaucracy into the political agenda and regime of the executive, then President Marcos. With the declaration of martial law, Marcos effectively centralized power in his hands. He ruled by decree and controlled all branches of government, including the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Philippine bureaucracy experienced its own institutional development and relationship with the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government in the period from 1946 to 1972, under the democratic framework and processes stipulated by the 1935 Constitution. It was centralized bureaucracy under the President, who was responsible over national agencies and local government units. Decision-making occurred at the level of the executive and national offices. So Ferdinand Marcos' authoritarian rule lasted until 1986, when the People Power Revolution led to his ouster and the restoration of democracy in the Philippines. The post-Marcos era saw significant efforts to rebuild democratic institutions, promote transparency, and address the legacies of his regime. So, there are two scenarios under the Marcos authoritarian. So, first is the dualism in the bureaucracy, performance, and development administration. The second is the alternative development pursued by socio-political movements in the struggle against the Marcos regime. So, first is the dualism in the bureaucracy's performance and development administration. So the first scenario was the government bureaucracy's implementation of development programs along the track of Marcos' political agenda. Even while it cooperated with international efforts, including the directions of the United Nations and international aid agencies for development in the Philippines as in other third world countries. The doublespeak and duplicity of the Marcos regime referred to the juxtaposition of Marcos' rhetoric on government programs for Philippine development with his own personal interests. Though this, the second scenario was the means that was the growth of socio-political movements in the countryside struggling against Marcos and the regime's development administration, while engaged in people empowerment of alternative development. The course of the Marcos regime parallel the growth of development of social movements among the peasantry, labor, and even the urban poor. So some churches move out of their institutional domains to engage in alternative development among the people. And in the struggle against the Marcos regime, these social groups initiated models for alternative development in health, environment, livelihood, empowerment, and participatory processes, among others, that challenged the bureaucracy performance under the Marcos regime. So the bureaucracy was construed to have lost its political neutrality as it became an instrument of the Marcos regime. It was described as a dominated, co-opted, subservient bureaucracy in its relationship with the executive that exercised authoritarian rule and leadership over just one political party in the Philippines. However, it was also argued that civil servants merely complied with their administrative duties and responsibilities in the tradition of the bureaucracy subordination to the executive branch. So now let's proceed to the challenges to Philippine bureaucracy, democracy, development, governance. So first is the civil service and capability building. The civil service represents the human resources component of the bureaucracy. So the structure of the bureaucracy, the size and capacities of manpower or human resources, the system of human resource management and human resource development are major areas for transformation. So, with devolution as the form of political decentralization, a percentage of the civil service personnel with move from the national agencies to the local government units. So in 1993, the Civil Service Commission and the Department of Budget and Management attempted at an inventory of personnel for an updated and actual headcount. The constitutional bodies such as Commission on Human Rights, Ombudsman, Civil Service Commission, Commission on Elections, Commission on Audit, registered 18,381 personnel or 2% of total, and the autonomous regions at 3,188 or 0.4% of total personnel. With the governance framework, the encounters of the civil service personnel with civil society groups had been quite a learning process on alternative approaches to development. The civil service also needed adjustments and training on the recent concepts and norms of new public management, such as client satisfaction, total quality management, productivity, transparency, accountability, and public ethics. So the second one is the re-engineering privatization and new public management. So downsizing and re-engineering have taken place at the national level offices, but some departments have yet to fully work out the processes at the regional offices. So the structure of the executive bureaucracy includes following: President's Executive Office, Executive Line Departments, Government Control, and own corporations. There are independent agencies as well as the legislator and the judiciary with the respective internal bureaucracy. So, the reengineering plan by the Department of Budget and Management aimed at restructuring supported by rationalization of the compensation and human resource development system, impact mitigation measures, and individual performance accountability system. So, other institutional reforms aimed at curbing corruption and unethical practices in strategic agencies and bureaucratic processes. For instance, procurement is one of the critical areas for reform. The change processes have been supported by legislation and executive policies, by the implementation phase obstacles attributed to long-standing negative practices, traditions, and personalistic interests. So last is the conclusion. So democracy, decentralization, governance, and development are four essential concepts and frameworks through which the Philippine bureaucracy performance can be evaluated, reckoning with time and milestones in Philippine political history. So the establishment of the bureaucracy and the administrative system form part of the democratic and presidential system of government at the outset of entered independence from American rule. So within its structure and system of administration, the bureaucracy was the focus of democratization processes as much as it was an agent or catalyst of democratization. So the merit system and political neutrality were major indications of a modern bureaucracy and public administrative system in the service of democracy and political development in the Philippines. So considering the pressures from political parties and the influence of political leaders at the time of the young Philippine Republic, strictly confining the term bureaucracy to refer to the executive bureaucracy, it was able to serve under conditions of subordination to the Philippine president and normal political transition from one elected official to the next. In the early years of the Philippine Republic, the bureaucracy performed functions of service delivery and policy enforcement of post-war development and rehabilitation given the centralized setup of the government.